April 28, 1945. The air above the Führer bunker complex in Berlin carried the acrid smell of burning paper. In a cramped communication room beneath 15 feet of reinforced concrete, Oberleutnant Werner Kleist stood before an iron stove, its belly glowing orange with heat. His hands trembled as he fed document after document into the flames. Teletype messages, coded dispatches, operational orders that had once directed armies across continents. Each page curled and blackened, transforming years of Reich communication into ash. The temperature in the room climbed past comfort. Sweat tracked down Kleist's face, but he couldn't stop. The orders were explicit. Nothing must survive. Nothing must tell the story of what they had known, what they had transmitted, what they had chosen to believe. Outside, Soviet artillery shells walked closer with each passing hour, their percussion rattling dust from concrete seams. The Third Reich, which had promised to last 1,000 years, was counting its final hours in single digits. And in that suffocating room, a 26-year-old communication officer was erasing the evidence of its collapse one telegram at a time. The story of what Werner Kleist burned that day and why those messages mattered begins not in the desperation of Berlin's final hours, but in the confidence of Germany's early victories. Communication officers like Kleist were the nervous system of the Wehrmacht, trained specialists who received, decoded, and transmitted the orders that moved divisions, launched offensives, and reported the daily realities of total war. They occupied a unique position in the military hierarchy, privy to information that ordinary soldiers never saw, yet sworn to secrecy that isolated them even from their comrades. They knew the whole picture when others saw only fragments. They read the truth while propaganda painted fiction for public consumption. Werner Kleist had joined the Wehrmacht Communication Corps in 1939 with the idealism common to young men of his generation. The Reich's propaganda machine had spent 6 years convincing Germans that their nation stood on the threshold of destiny, that National Socialist ideology would correct the humiliations of Versailles, unite the German people, and establish a new European order. For a young man from a middle-class family in Bavaria, the Communication Corps offered both service to that vision and escape from the provincial limitations of his birthplace. He trained at the Signal School in Halle, learning Morse code, teletype operation, encryption procedures, and the rigid protocols that governed military communication. By the time France fell in June 1940, Kleist believed he was part of something invincible. The messages that flowed through communication centers during those early years reinforced that belief. Reports of the blitzkrieg across Poland arrived in bursts of triumphant statistics. Enemy divisions encircled, cities captured, resistance collapsing ahead of schedule. The French campaign produced even more intoxicating dispatches. Wehrmacht units advancing faster than planned, enemy forces in disarray, Paris falling with minimal resistance. Communication officers transmitted these victories to higher commands and received back the Führer's congratulations, promotion orders, and directives for the next phase of expansion. The messages told a story of ideological vindication. National Socialism worked. Germanic superiority was fact. The new order was inevitable. But military communication carries 2 categories of information: what units report upward to command, and what command sends downward to units. Young officers like Kleist primarily handled the former during the early war years, victory reports flowing up the chain. The real test of belief came later, when the character of messages began to change. The first dissonance appeared in reports from the Eastern Front in the winter of 1941. Kleist, by then stationed at a Wehrmacht communication hub near Warsaw, began receiving and processing dispatches that didn't match the public narrative, where propaganda spoke of victorious advances toward Moscow. The classified messages told of supply breakdowns, equipment failures in extreme cold, and casualties mounting beyond replacement rates. One message that burned itself into Kleist's memory arrived on December 8, 1941, a frantic request from an encircled division for cold weather gear, medical supplies, and immediate reinforcement. The temperature at their position had dropped to minus 38 degrees Celsius. Men were losing fingers and toes to frostbite. The division's operational strength had fallen by 40% in 2 weeks, not from Soviet action but from the cold itself. Kleist transmitted the request up the chain. The response that came back ordered the division to hold position, promised supplies that logistics officers privately acknowledged couldn't arrive in time, and forbade any mention of difficulties in subsequent reports. This pattern, desperate requests from field units met with unrealistic orders and communication restrictions from above, became routine. Communication officers occupied the painful middle ground between reality and ideology, between what was happening and what the Reich needed to believe was happening. The messages revealed another truth that propaganda concealed: the material disparity between the Wehrmacht and its enemies. Reports from North Africa described British and American forces equipped with vehicles, aircraft, and supplies in quantities that German units couldn't match. After the Allied invasion of Italy, dispatches noted the overwhelming firepower American artillery could deliver, the reliability of American trucks and jeeps, the abundance of rations that meant enemy soldiers never fought hungry. One intercepted Allied communication, decoded and translated by Kleist's section in early 1944, was a routine supply, manifest for a single American infantry division. It listed quantities of food, ammunition, fuel, and equipment that exceeded what an entire Wehrmacht corps could expect to receive in a month. These messages created a cognitive dissonance that grew harder to ignore. The ideology Kleist had absorbed insisted that National Socialism made Germany strong, that Germanic discipline and will exceeded the soft democracy's material advantages, that Jews and Bolsheviks and capitalists were inferior and therefore must lose. But the classified messages told a different story. They described an enemy with apparently unlimited resources, military systems that emphasized logistics and supply as much as battlefield tactics, and soldiers who fought not from ideological fanaticism, but from steady material-supported confidence. The symbolism of food appeared repeatedly in these dispatches. Wehrmacht intelligence reports on captured American positions invariably noted the quantity and quality of rations. Canned goods, chocolate bars, coffee, cigarettes, all packaged in waterproof containers and delivered with remarkable consistency even to frontline units. German soldiers on reduced rations, subsisting increasingly on ersatz, coffee, and potatoes, captured enemy supplies and found evidence of an abundance that seemed incomprehensible. One message that Kleist processed in France, dated July 1944, came from a Wehrmacht unit that had briefly recaptured an American field kitchen. The report's tone mixed military assessment with something approaching amazement. The Americans had been feeding a battalion-sized force with fresh bread, meat, real coffee, and sweets. The German officer filing the report couldn't resist editorializing. How could a military system deliver such abundance to a combat zone while the Wehrmacht struggled to provide basic nutrition? By 1944, Kleist and his fellow communication officers were transmitting two parallel narratives. Official communiques spoke of strategic withdrawals, defensive victories, and the imminent deployment of wonder weapons that would reverse the war's trajectory. But the classified operational messages painted a portrait of systematic collapse. Units under strength and undersupplied, replacement soldiers too young or too old, fuel shortages that grounded aircraft and paralyzed armor, and a transportation network crumbling under Allied bombing. Communication officers read both narratives. The tension between them became unbearable. The orders to falsify or suppress information grew more explicit as the military situation deteriorated. After the Allied breakout from Normandy, Kleist's section received directives specifying what could and couldn't be included in situation reports. Casualty figures were to be minimized. Supply shortages were not to be mentioned in any communication that might be intercepted. Any assessment suggesting that operational objectives couldn't be met was to be reworded or rejected. The communication network, which should have provided commanders with accurate information for decision-making, was being systematically corrupted to preserve ideological fictions. Some communication officers resisted these orders, filing accurate reports despite the restrictions. Several were arrested by the Gestapo, accused of defeatism or worse. Kleist walked a careful line, complying with directives while privately keeping records of the authentic messages, the real situation reports that revealed the war's true trajectory. He told himself these records might matter someday, might serve as evidence that some officers had seen the truth. But keeping them was dangerous. The gap between what he knew and what he was allowed to transmit created a moral weight that pressed heavier with each passing month. The messages from the concentration camp system added another dimension to that weight. Communication officers at certain levels handled encrypted dispatches related to SS operations, deportations, and the bureaucracy of the final solution. These messages used euphemisms, a special treatment, resettlement, evacuation, but their meaning became clear to anyone who processed multiple dispatches and noted the patterns. Thousands of people sent to specific locations, few or no return transports, requests for expanded crematorium capacity, orders for additional Zyklon B shipments. Kleist never saw the gas chambers, but the messages painted their shadow. When he later spoke of this period, decades after the war, Kleist described the psychological mechanism that allowed him to continue functioning: compartmentalization. He told himself he was a technician, a communications specialist performing a technical function. He transmitted messages but wasn't responsible for their content. He followed orders but didn't make policy. This mental framework was common among Wehrmacht officers who occupied positions where they knew too much to plead ignorance but couldn't escape their roles without severe consequences. It was self-deception, Kleist acknowledged, but self-deception that seemed necessary for daily survival. The American advance into Germany in early 1945 brought a new category of messages across Kleist's desk: reports from Wehrmacht units that had surrendered to Western forces. Military intelligence debriefed German prisoners who were then held in American or British POW camps, and information about these camps filtered back through various channels. The messages described conditions that contradicted everything Nazi ideology had predicted. Prisoners received adequate food, those Red Cross parcels again, the chocolate bars, the coffee. They were housed in heated barracks. Medical care was provided. Violence was rare and, when it occurred, punished. The Americans, who were supposed to be Jewish-controlled gangsters, treated German prisoners according to Geneva Convention standards. These reports created another ideological crisis for true believers. The regime had spent years warning that capture by the Allies, particularly the Soviets but also the Western democracies, meant torture, starvation, or execution. Goebbels' propaganda had painted a picture of an enemy so monstrous that surrender was unthinkable. But the classified messages told a different story. German soldiers surrendering to American or British forces found themselves treated with what many described as surprising humanity, not friendship, not absolution, but basic human decency and the rule of law. The contrast with the Eastern Front was stark. Messages from units facing the Red Army described exactly the horrors that propaganda had predicted, horrors that the Wehrmacht had itself inflicted on Soviet territory and that were now being repaid in kind. But the Western Front presented a moral complexity that ideology couldn't explain, an enemy that fought ferociously yet observed rules, that possessed overwhelming material superiority yet didn't abuse it against prisoners, that represented everything the Reich called decadent yet demonstrated a kind of strength the Wehrmacht was losing. By April 1945, when Kleist was transferred to Berlin for the final defense of the capital, the messages arriving at the Führer Bunker Communication Center had taken on a surreal quality. Field units that no longer existed were still listed on operational maps. Supply convoys that would never arrive were still referenced in planning documents. Relief forces consisting of decimated divisions or Hitler Youth formations were assigned to counterattacks that had no possibility of success. The gap between message and reality had become absolute. Communication officers found themselves transmitting orders to units that had ceased to exist, reporting situations that bore no relationship to facts, and maintaining a fictional narrative of resistance while the actual front collapsed around them. The order to destroy all communication records came on April 25th, 4 days after Kleist arrived in the bunker complex. It was both expected and devastating. Every communication center maintained archives, copies of important messages, operational logs, communication protocols. These archives were the institutional memory of the military communication network, the record of what had actually been transmitted and when. They were also evidence of war crimes ordered and acknowledged, evidence of systematic deception and falsification, evidence of the gap between propaganda and reality, evidence that many officers had known the truth and continued operating the machinery of a criminal regime. Kleist spent 3 days feeding documents into the stove. His hands became blackened with ash. The heat in the room grew oppressive, but he couldn't open windows or doors. The burning had to happen quickly before the Soviet advance made destruction impossible. Other officers worked nearby, burning their own records. No one spoke much. There was nothing to say. They were erasing the evidence of their own complicity, destroying the proof of what they had known and when they had known it. But memory doesn't burn. As Kleist watched the messages turn to ash, their contents remained vivid in his mind. He remembered specific dispatches, particular phrases, the mounting evidence of collapse that the communication network had faithfully transmitted even as public propaganda proclaimed victory. He remembered the food manifests from captured American supplies, the prisoner reports describing adequate treatment, the desperate pleas from surrounded units that went unanswered. He remembered the euphemistic SS messages that documented crimes beyond reckoning. The paper burned, but the knowledge remained. Werner Kleist survived the fall of Berlin. He was captured by Soviet forces on May 2, 1945, spent 4 years in a prisoner of war camp, and eventually returned to West Germany in 1949. He did not speak publicly about his wartime experiences for decades. The immediate post-war years were characterized by widespread German silence about the Third Reich, a collective desire to move forward rather than examine what had happened and why. Former Wehrmacht officers could find employment and social acceptance if they didn't dwell on the past, if they accepted the emerging narrative that the military had been separate from the regime's crimes, that ordinary soldiers had simply followed orders and done their duty. But that narrative was false, and communication officers like Kleist knew it better than most. They had seen the orders. They had transmitted the reports. They had occupied the position where information flowed and truth was most visible. In the 1970s, as Germany began seriously confronting its history, Kleist started giving interviews to historians. He spoke to war crimes investigators. He provided testimony about the communication network and what it had known. He couldn't produce the documents. Those had burned in April 1945. But he could provide testimony about their contents, context, and implications. In these interviews, Kleist emphasized certain themes. First, that the military communication system had provided accurate information to leadership about the war's trajectory from 1942 onward. The leadership had known they were losing, known the material imbalance, known the ideological promises weren't manifesting. Second, that communication officers at his level had been aware of SS operations and the Holocaust, aware through the messages they handled, aware in ways that created moral responsibility even if they weren't personally present at camps or killing sites. Third, that evidence of all this had been systematically destroyed in the war's final weeks, not through chaos, but through deliberate orders designed to obscure the historical record. The symbolic weight of those burning messages, the specific order to destroy evidence, became central to how Kleist understood his own story. He had spent years transmitting the Reich's communications, maintaining the network that allowed a criminal regime to function across conquered territories. When ordered to destroy the evidence of that system, he had complied. He had burned the messages. This compliance, he came to believe, was the final act of cowardice in a career of institutional complicity. The regime had asked him to erase truth, and he had done it, but imperfectly. The destruction of documents was never complete. Allied forces captured Wehrmacht communication centers intact in some locations. Archives survived in fragments. Other communication officers, in other locations, chose to hide rather than burn certain documents, preserving evidence despite orders. The historical record was damaged, but not erased. Enough survived to document what the Reich had done and what its officers had known. More importantly, witnesses survived. Men and women who had read the messages, processed the information, transmitted the orders. The paper might burn, but memory persisted. Testimony could reconstruct what documents would have shown. The regime's attempt to escape historical accountability through destruction of evidence was always going to fail, because human beings can't be burned as easily as paper. The recurring image from Kleist's testimony, the image that historians and documentary makers have returned to repeatedly, is that iron stove in the Führer bunker, glowing with the heat of burning messages. It represents several things simultaneously: the Reich's consciousness of its own criminality, its desperate attempt to escape judgment, and the ultimate futility of that attempt. You can burn paper, you can destroy archives, you can order silence. But truth has a stubborn persistence that transcends documents. It lives in the minds of witnesses, in the patterns of evidence that survive despite destruction, in the logic of events that can be reconstructed even when specific records are lost. The messages Kleist burned told the story of a regime's systematic failure, military, ideological, and moral. They documented the gap between propaganda and reality, between ideological promises and material facts, between what the leadership claimed and what they actually knew. They showed a military communication system that had provided accurate information to commanders who refused to act on it, who preferred ideology to evidence, who ordered the falsification and destruction of truth rather than confronting facts that contradicted belief. Those messages also told a smaller, more personal story, the story of men like Werner Kleist, who occupied positions where truth was visible but action was constrained, who knew what the regime was but continued serving it, who compartmentalized moral knowledge to maintain psychological function. These men were not the architects of the Reich's crimes, but they were its infrastructure, the technicians and specialists who kept the machinery operating even after they understood what the machine was doing. In his final interviews before his death in 1994, Kleist spoke about the burden of that knowledge. He described the particular weight carried by those who knew early but acted late or not at all. He acknowledged that burning the messages had been wrong, that preserving evidence might have been worth the personal cost of refusing orders. He expressed something between regret and guilt, not a clean, simple emotion, but the complicated moral residue of choices made under pressure, of cowardice masquerading as pragmatism, of service to evil justified through technical competence. The story of the messages ordered burned in April 1945 is ultimately a story about the relationship between truth and power, between evidence and ideology. The Third Reich fell not because it lacked military skill or technological capability, but because its ideological foundation was based on lies that reality refused to validate. German soldiers were not inherently superior to their enemies. National Socialism did not produce economic or material miracles. The democracies were not decadent or weak. Jews and other targeted groups were not the source of Germany's problems. Every one of the Reich's core ideological claims was false, and the military communication network transmitted evidence of that falsity from 1942 onward. The order to burn messages was an implicit acknowledgement of those lies. A regime confident in its righteousness would have preserved records to vindicate its actions. The destruction of evidence revealed consciousness of guilt, awareness that history would judge and condemn. The messages burned, but that awareness survived in the hasty destruction itself, in the officers who carried out burning orders, in the fragments and witnesses that escaped destruction. On April 28, 1945, Werner Kleist stood before an iron stove and fed the truth into flames, watching paper curl and blacken, transforming years of communication into ash. He was following orders, protecting the regime one final time, erasing evidence of what they had all known. But as he would later understand, some truths survive any fire. They live in memory, in testimony, in the logic of events that no amount of burning can obscure. The messages were destroyed, but their meaning endured. A final message that the Reich itself transmitted. Guilt knows itself and destroys evidence. The iron stove in the Führer bunker consumed thousands of documents in those final days, but it couldn't consume what those documents had represented: the accumulated evidence of a regime's criminality and an ideology's failure. That evidence survived in scattered fragments, in Allied captures, in testimony like Kleist's. It survives still, a permanent indictment that no amount of burning could erase. Truth, it turns out, is more persistent than paper, more durable than ideology, harder to kill than the men who served it.